Getting the early numbers could be the key to success when betting on the NFL. That's why we're here to react to the pinnacle openers and analyse where the market might move. Welcome to the opening line. Hello and welcome to the opening line as we prepare for the wildcard round of the NFL playoffs. We today is Andy Molitor, Eric Eager and Rufus Peabody, and we're going to be running through the early numbers this weekend's game. It's been a while, guys. How are you? All good?
Yeah,
things are good. Interesting week 17 for sure.
Yeah, I think instead of going back to week 17, I think what we can maybe do is start off with like a kind of look back at the regular season as a whole. I know kind of week to week we've taken a snapshot of how things have gone the week before, but I'll leave it open to you, and it can be sort of individuals, it can be teams. It doesn't necessarily have to be specifically betting related. It's kind of your choice. Rufus, I'll start with you. What was your kind of key takeaway over the 17 weeks of the regular season?
So there's a few really bad teams, clearly. Jacksonville, the Jets. Although I still think they're not that bad. I'm gonna die on that hill.
You can't get them in anymore.
But there has been so much parity in terms of actual performance at the top. You know, if I look at my numbers without priors, I would make Kansas City the sixth best team. If I didn't know, anything about Mahomes coming into the season and all that, like clearly Kansas City is, I think, the best team and the most talented team probably. I mean, but there's, Green Bay, New Orleans, Buffalo, Seattle, Baltimore have all played exceptionally well. Or I should say they've all they're I guess, in that sort of first strata based on the field performance this season. And they're really the difference between those teams in terms of on-field performance this year is only 2 points. So I think it really is more wide open, or it feels more wide open in both conferences than most years.
And what about yourself? The
that's
season
fair. I mean,
been as a whole, and any sort of real learning.
Yeah, the wide open comment makes sense too, especially with if you do take your priors out and get that out of your head. Yes, Kansas City, what they did, if you forget about the 3 playoff games and just how that offense can turn on and just fire on it and just ruin a team's day by, coming back and scoring a 28-point quarter. If you take all the priors out and just look at raw data, it's super bunched up in the top 6 and maybe even 7 teams in the playoffs right now. Obviously you have to know Kansas City, what they're capable of. And it's one of those interesting things, a big talking point has been Baltimore. Is Baltimore really good? Because they've played 5 terrible teams in a row and they've just beaten the tar out of these terrible teams. And it's kind of almost the opposite of that. Is Kansas City just not trying? They're not covering any games. They're winning, but they're not covering. It seems like they're more than comfortable just kind of coasting. So I think it could be, we could, in 2 weeks, we could be in a whole different scenario here when it's oh my God, Kansas City turned on the Jets for the playoffs and, their number gets flipped just hard. So it'll be interesting. Season as a whole, though, the totals are up 3 points. I mean, we talked about it early, and I think the average total was 48 this year. And I want to say last year I had it somewhere, it was 45 point something. So scoring's up. That should be fun.
Yeah, I mean, the Baltimore Ravens are a great case in what priors mean, right? Because to me, I think even if you throw out the last 5 games, let's say you would have put them in the playoffs at 6-5, we would have all been saying, okay, priors matter, and they're actually a dangerous team still. And then obviously you have the last 5 games of data, which we'll argue over the validity of, right? But they're an interesting team. I think they're the most probably dangerous wild card team, save maybe Tampa Bay. And I think a lot of that dangerousness is not necessarily what they've done since they got their players back, but more our opinion of them going into the season, obviously adjusted for some of the fundamental things like issues with their offensive line and Lamar's accuracy. But that one's an interesting one. Kansas City, I think the ending record of all so they were 8-0 on the road. They're 5 non-divisional road teams that they faced for Miami, Buffalo, Baltimore, New Orleans and Tampa, and those teams had a combined like 87-23 record or something like that. So, the interest, again, we're so drawn to endpoints and the fact that they were like 0-7-1 against the spread the last 8 or 9 weeks of the year. But a lot of that was because the Tampa Bay and Saints game, they dominated the whole game, and then they ended up getting backdoored, right? And to me, they're just a really interesting case of how much do you weigh your prior versus how much do you weigh the most recent information, how much are they really trying, and then also sort of like something like as silly as like how much their record against the number, which is somewhat arbitrary.
Yeah, they let's say they covered against Tampa and New Orleans essentially. Like they were touchdowns that were too late to do anything to get inside.
Same with Miami, they covered that number.
Yeah,
Miami kicked a field goal to cover the spread late.
Well, Eric, didn't you mentioned earlier this year that Andy Reid has typically gone with more vanilla play calling, against the worst teams. And I actually looked at this last week. I was really interested to see if there were any sort of coaching random effects in terms of interactions between a coach and how well they do or in their performance as a function of how good their opponent is. And so I did it using Massey Peabody game grades over the past 20 years. And I actually found there were some significant effects there. It's not saying that this coach is like really good against good teams and really bad against bad teams. It's just relative to how good they are overall. And Andy Reid was number 2 in terms of so this is going back to his Philadelphia days too, number 2 in terms of playing the best against the best teams. And can you guess who number 1 was?
Belichick.
I was like, and number three is Doug Peterson, which kind of surprised me, but I'm like, well, Andy Reid disciple, like this kind of, the top 5 rounding it out was like Doug Marrone at 4. And I think Brian Billick at 5. But interestingly, on the other extreme, and I'm sure we'll get to this team pretty soon, but Bruce Arians is the worst in terms of or best against bad teams. But I thought about this because John Harbaugh also is inside the top 5 there in terms of coaches who play better against bad teams.
Yeah. Yeah, the Harbaugh one checks out, doesn't it? Because they do seem to want to make a point against bad teams. You think about not only their performances in week 1 over the past 3 years, but also the closing line value that at least in 18 and 17, right? Where like the closing line value was like immense, right? People bet into Baltimore in week 1, moving the number like 3-4 points, and then Baltimore ends up winning by 40 in both cases. Whereas, they have struggled in the playoffs, and I, that's interesting that you say that. I didn't even look at that. I was literally just looking at how, basically predictable in, the way that I measure it, that Andy Reid is against bad teams and against good teams. And you think this season, they're probably getting everybody's best performance being the defending Super Bowl champ. You wonder, they're going to get everybody's best performance in the playoffs regardless. So I think if you take that, sort of out of there, they might be maybe a little, I wouldn't say they're undervalued in the betting markets, but they're probably undervalued in the mind of this sort of punditry.
And then, just on the Kansas City thing, what do you think people are kind of expecting then? Is it they're sat in kind of 3rd, 4th gear and they can take it up a notch? Is there some playbook that hasn't been owned by Andy Reid yet? Like, what is the logic behind it? Because they're clearly not just not trying to kind of not cover the spread or whatever it might be. So how do they improve and get to the level that people think they are at?
Necessity.
Yeah.
They'll have to be forced into it by putting in, and like Eric mentioned, the teams that they played. These are 3 teams that are, just 3 teams that are all kind of in the 8-12 range to win the Super Bowl in Tampa, Baltimore, and New Orleans. They handled business.
And Buffalo too.
And Buffalo, yeah. They really did handle business against good teams. There's so much hand wringing in the betting community because they can't cover for anyone.
Yeah.
And it's silly. It's like, no, they were the better team in the field. They played great. And it does have a feeling. Drew and I argued a little bit about this because he was very upset about the backdoor in the Saints game, and I said, well, doesn't it feel like this malaise that comes over a team after they win a Super Bowl? Like there was a high expectations, 18 was fun. 19, they got it done with all those comebacks. And now it's just like, it feels like the Lakers where it's just or the Warriors back in the days where it's like, all right, let's get through these 80 games, get back to the playoffs and win. And Drew said, well, that's very dangerous because in the NBA you got 7-game series, and here, it's one and done, and that's fair. But I just over the course of 60 minutes, they're a better team on the field.
Yeah, these are all. I mean, all of these are narratives, right? And I don't know if they do anything to predict anything. But I will say, people are always concerned about, okay, what if they come out flat in the playoffs and all that? And I'm like, how much more flat can you get than being down 24-0 to Houston, 17-7 to Tennessee, and then eventually, they didn't come out flat against. But they went 3-and-out in all 3 of their initial drives in last year's playoffs. Like, I'm not saying again, like. Assuming the Chiefs, there's nothing fundamental. Assuming everything with them is fundamentally okay. The motivational aspect, I think, is way overfitting what's happened over the last half of the season because, if motivation were a deal, all Andy Reid has to do is go and look at how difficult their playoff stretch was in terms of coming back from behind. And what was the point? The point was coming out of the gate slow. And I think that's what people were worried about for them resting their starters last week. People worried about, obviously their record against the spread over the second half of the year. I think those, to me, if you're going to bet against Kansas City in the playoffs, it has to be over something fundamental, like their defense isn't good enough or Mahomes has regressed. Both of those things could be true, but I don't think the reason to bet against them is any sort of motivational thing or their lack of an edge.
Well, I think you mentioned the word narrative, Eric. There's been quite a few things, I think, this season where, in terms of data, there's been an edge to be found. I mean, we've talked to, I know Andy mentioned sort of the points totals. We've talked about home advantage without any fans. A lot of talk around sort of more analytic-minded coaches and obviously the whole injury list, COVID list, and kind of getting ahead of the game in that one. We're at the point where a lot of people are saying, they're not getting as much down, they're not betting as much because the markets are now as efficient as they will be throughout the season. Is that something moving into the playoffs for someone like yourself, Rufus? Is that something that you're wary of? What's sort of like a normal playoffs like for you in terms of action compared to the regular season?
Well, there's fewer games, so yeah, there's definitely less action, and the lines are generally pretty efficient. So I'll find stuff, sometimes something a little bit off market or something early in the week to bet, but it's definitely not as much as in the regular season.
And how about you, Andy?
Yeah, I mean, the lines are tight. The closer is like 49%. It's right in there. It's the closing line on the sides are very tight. There's some signal to some unders in the wild card round, but we found. But again, it's hard to tell if any of this is signal. Just there's so few games. Somebody was asking me to run some queries for them, and I said, well, I can run that, but it's gonna be like 12 games over the course of so many years. Like you might not find much in there. So yeah, it's fewer games, but interestingly enough, I made a bet in all 4 wildcard games last season. And I make about 100 bets a season in the NFL. So it just sometimes it happens, sometimes it doesn't. I did have some bets this year because there's 2 extra games.
Are you more likely to place a bet on a smaller edge in the playoffs just because you want to have a little bit on it when you're watching the game?
I try not to, but I think I probably did with the one that lost last year was I believe it was Seattle, where I think I got beat by the hook. I feel like I had a push in there somewhere too, but the playoffs haven't gone bad for me traditionally. So hopefully that's more of a case of actually finding some edges and just not the fact that it's a sample size of like 14 games ever.
What the non-stationarity of it too is really tricky to go along with the sample size, right? Like this year, there's not only a lack of home field advantage, for example, Washington, Rufus's favorite team made the playoffs this year, which is kind of cool. Seattle, no home field advantage as well, but then Buffalo is going to have, 7,000 fans or so. Tennessee, I believe,
crazy fans.
Well, and the weather in Buffalo is generally a big advantage at this time of year in Green Bay, and yeah,
exactly. And then another one is New Orleans, where I think, it depends upon how you measure these things. There was Michael Lopez just wrote a really cool paper about how soccer, different leagues were affected home field advantage with respect to COVID, and like depending upon who you trust, like, or how you do the experiment, like New Orleans has a better home field advantage than some, and they're not going to have any. Like, does their reduction, is that more in the playoffs? Is it less in the playoffs? I mean, does it matter because Chicago's terrible? Like, those are really good questions to ask. Or, I do also think of, like, how do you do the Pittsburgh-Cleveland game? Like, we've literally never had a playoff game before where the head coach isn't able to coach, and the special teams coordinator, Mike Prefer, is the head coach in a game. Like, we've never had that before. And so how do you handicap that? Do you go back to other games where a coach has been replaced? Because usually when a coach is replaced, it's because that team was bad already. Or there's really weird situations. This is the weirdest of them, and so how do you just stay away from that game entirely, or is there an edge to have?
Yeah, not only that, but a play caller.
Yeah,
I mean, he called the plays. I honestly I can't tell you what the offensive coordinator's name is in most of these teams. Van Pelt, there it is. Like the ones where the offensive coordinator doesn't call plays, it's just like I don't usually know these guys because and it's funny that Prefer came up. I had to look him up. Eric will remember this. Yeah. Prefer he had a bit of a mix up with the Vikings punter a few years ago, and I think he ended up losing his job over some slurs or something. So I hadn't heard that name in quite a while.
Yeah.
Yeah, he got
and that's an added fragility that we've never had to deal with. Like, for example, I said this on Wharton Moneyball last week. I said, if Andy Reid wakes up and gets to the stadium, that's half the battle for the Chiefs, right? Because he calls
the other half's Mahomes.
Like Cleveland, when you lose your head coach and he's also the play caller, that's two coaches in one, right? In many ways, and that's we just, it's a difficult thing to, like the number is now 6. It was 4.5, 3.5 early on the open. Like, is that enough? I feel like just, intuitively that seems like too many, but who knows?
Yeah. It was Alex Van Pelt. Was he a Bills quarterback? Am I remembering that right?
That's right. Yep. You're right. He was the one. He was the one he was the one that they started him for like 8 games, and then they traded for Drew Bledsoe. And then, so he became Bledsoe's backup.
So in terms of home field advantage, I thought it was a really interesting point you made, Eric, about how it's going to vary by team some and with the fans. But I was, in preparation for the Calcutta we did last week, I actually was doing some market ratings to try to get a sense of, using regression essentially to try to, like, based on market line, to sort of get a sense of where the market had teams. And one interesting thing I noticed was how home field advantage in the market changed. So this is controlling for the team and opponent. At the beginning of the season, the implied home field advantage was about 1.8 points, a little higher. It's down to less than 0.5 point now in the last few weeks. So basically the market thinks home field advantage is almost non-existent. And I hadn't actually revisited home field advantage throughout the season. I'd gone like 80 to 85%. And that's caused me to revisit because I'm, the market is pretty smart, and who am I to, like, do I have any better information? No, not necessarily. So I'm still going a little more than the market, but yeah. And I'm also taking it a little bit more on a case by case basis. Like Kansas City does have fans in the stands, like enough that we might get some ref bias. Like, I don't know what the tipping point there is, but it's certainly interesting.
Yeah, the Lopez paper found.
Don't adjust too hard now that, like what Eric said, it may bounce back, especially in certain stadiums here.
Right. I mean, like, I'm giving Green Bay like full home field advantage, basically, despite not having fans, just largely because of the weather and the fact that, well, Green Bay is also a place that's a little, I mean, you're not in a major city exactly. It's
Appleton.
The teams play. Yeah, the teams actually stay an hour away in Appleton. And so there's weird travel things there. I mean, it's interesting, right? Like, you guys remember when Minnesota played in Green Bay early in the year, and the weather in Green Bay actually forced the betting market. Like, the betting markets bet into Minnesota once that weather became advantageous for a running game, right? Because that was sort of played into Minnesota's thing. So absent fans, Green Bay's home field advantage actually diminished a little bit, but that's it's such an interesting question, because, like, even then at the actual home field advantage has been about 5/100ths of a point this year, and the betting markets are still giving 10 times that, so there's still some respect being given to it on average, But I think a case by case basis is huge, right? Like, I've done some research basically looking at, what percentage of fans are actually rooting for that particular team. And there's some, proprietary data and stuff like that. Like, and that's what makes New Orleans a decent home field advantage. That's what makes Seattle a team like Washington when they go to Carolina with a lot of, prior to the Panthers being a team in the NFL, most people in the Carolinas were Washington fans. So like that game, very little home field advantage because a lot of the people there were Washington fans. So but like those things go away now, right? And so it's a real, or now in Buffalo, like how many of those people actually going to Buffalo are going to be Colts fans this weekend? Probably not, so there's a ton of interesting things there.
I think we all have to have a good degree of humility on it, though. There's a lot we don't know, and but
especially the Cleveland game, it's almost impossible to quantify what the coaches mean.
Yeah,
get rid of the word almost.
There's also going to be a lot as we get into playoffs. There's going to be these kind of narratives about like certain teams or certain players, like Lamar can't handle it. I think Big Ben hasn't got the greatest of records. Not playoff specific. There's something about Tom Brady the other day needing to get to bed early and playing at 8:30 at night. Andy, in your kind of time betting, I guess maybe give a word of warning to people that are tuning in about sort of the danger of narratives and what they don't mean, what they do mean, and how they can be dangerous for bettors.
Not only, I mean, there's two things working against people that are going to hear those. The fact that there's fewer games, so they get amplified. That we hear these narratives all week and all year through the media, but, there's 13, 14, 15, 16 games every week. So sometimes they do get lost in noise, but there's some of these narratives that really, really get pushed hard this week because of how few games there are and how much the media is going to cover the playoffs and just how much more some of this, the rise of gambling across the U.S. is supposed to, just how many more media outlets are putting gambling content into their sports, and they're going to bring up some trends, and they're going to bring out some, this team is this bad. Again, we used to see this all the time with certain quarterbacks where they'd say this is their record in games that are under 37 degrees and whatever. And, there is some signal in some of that stuff, but it is really going to get shoved down some people's throats this year. And, just kind of watch out for that and actually maybe do some research and see if there's some deeper context in some of those games. You can say like, oh, this team is horrible in cold weather. And then you go look and be like, well, every time they played in cold weather over this section of time they used, it was like, man, they were playing like the Steelers at their peak. They were playing in Foxborough. They played Rodgers at his peak. Like they always just ended up playing these good Northern teams at the end of the year. Like maybe there's not so much signal. Maybe they just did poorly against some really good teams that happen to play in the cold.
Well, I always thought about this when, because Kansas City went from 1993 until 2015 without winning a playoff game. And, it was like, well, are the Chiefs cursed and all of a sudden I'm like, look at all the games. They had the worst quarterback in every single game, except for the one game they won in 2015 where Alex Smith was playing Brian Hoyer. Like sometimes it's a little simpler or sometimes the answer is actually fairly fundamental and not, not something galaxy brain.
Well, now we're going to have a narrative that says always bet on the better quarterback. I think the thing you need to watch out for is the arbitrary endpoints. When people give you trends and stuff and they say, oh, the last 17 games, something, or like 37 degrees, like, this is his quarterback's record under 37 degrees. Well, he obviously, if it's bad, I'm guessing he won in a game that was 38 degrees. I think that people are pushing a narrative because it's, if you're trying to justify a pick or create content, if you need something to say. And so you're going to try to find the thing that sounds the most significant. So I think about things on a continuum. Like if this quarterback is bad in cold weather, is it a discrete is cold, isn't cold, or is it, as it gets colder? And just in general, I feel like with these things, if there is an effect, you should be able to quantify it and add it into your handicapping. So, for example, something like that would be like extra days rest. That's something you can quantify, So next week, like Green Bay is going to get a bump, Kansas City is going to get a bump for that. But just for me, if I can't quantify something and I don't have, Cleveland, the head coach Stefanski being out, I can't quantify. But Clemson did not have their offensive coordinator and play caller against Ohio State, and you saw how that worked out. So maybe that is worth a little bit more than I had thought. But basically, if it isn't something that sort of has a direct, it isn't just quantifiable, but it's sort of a direct impact, then I'm going to think it's mostly speculation. Like one example was last week, you had the Washington-Philadelphia game. That line, steamed really hard towards Washington throughout the week, but mostly, Sunday morning. And it got up to 6.5. It was at 1.5 early in the week. And yes, you heard Miles Sanders is out. A few guys were going to be rested. There was some rumors, but for the most part, and this is a situation where this actually is bad advice, but for the most part, there wasn't anything concrete that I could go on. It was this speculation that Philadelphia wasn't going to give full effort. And generally, for every time that, I'll put it this way. How often have you actually seen a team like legitimately try to tank a game in game? So, I was wrong in this occasion, but I think overall, if you ignore stuff that isn't really concrete, you're probably gonna be a little better off.
Well, and Philly covered the closing number in that game anyway, right? So, that was the funniest thing. But we had, to your point, we had the exact opposite thing happen at the 1:00 hour where we're doing a live show, and all of a sudden there's this information that Bitcoin Barkley's going to play for Buffalo. And that number went, I think that got as high as -3 in Buffalo's direction, all the way to 3 or 4 in Miami's direction. And that information was bad. I mean, Buffalo tried, for most of the first half of the game. And, I think it was Ed Miller's book and Matthew Davido's book said basically for a lot of these things, it has to glide. There has to be some continuity to it. If let's say the Packers have to play on Saturday next week, them having 13 days rest better be incrementally worse than having 14 days rest, right? There's not these jumps. There isn't anything special about certain numbers. And I think that we have to be, and I think anytime when we talk about trends, you have to be aware of the fact that usually the better thing to do is just to plot it and look at one thing on one axis and the other thing on the other. But the reason people don't do that is because most of these things are noise. And so you just find the cutoff that makes it look the best.
The overfitting, like Rufus said, the finding the endpoint that works the best to make a graphic for your television show, that's 100%. It's not 100% of these. But a lot of these, it's overfitting to create a narrative, and that's where if you actually plotted it out and went past that random endpoint, not a random, it's a very unrandom endpoint, went past the endpoint, and looked and be like, oh, it's just a really small cluster and it's noise.
Yeah, Andy, I remember a few years ago, actually it was probably 5 years ago at the beginning of the college football season, I was hearing all these trends. And so I decided to go through data and find some good trends myself. And I found that college football teams over 10 years, the previous 10 years, college football teams whose school name started with the letter O covered at a 58% clip over 700, 600, 700 plus games. And there you go.
You were the one that was.
You can get a private island with that kind of trend.
That's it. If ever you could sum up the dangers of data mining, I think you've just done it, Rufus. Let's get us on to some wild card matchups. Then we'll start with, we've got the Colts versus the Bills. The Pinnacle traders think we're a little bit late to budge on this one. We were at just a 7 and 52 on the total. It's now -6.5 on the Bills and 51 on the total. I think you kind of mentioned about the Chiefs for kind of their ability to cover have been like a big talking point this season. The Bills have had a lot of focus as well. They divided opinion early on, I think, and then we had plenty of doubters around Josh Allen that I don't think anyone can dispute that they've played well. They've played pretty consistently. A couple of losses at the Chiefs. They had one was at the Cardinals. They lost on the Hail Mary, but for the most part, they've kind of got it done and against some decent teams too. As for Indy, I mean, they've improved. Pretty easy schedule for them, I think you have to say. I mean, can't rely on the run game, but it's probably all about how Taylor performs, isn't it? I guess, and become I'm keen to see what you think about that one, how important he's going to be, and if there's anything interesting in this matchup that makes the number sort of jump out to you.
I mean, I took a +7 just because it was, I mean, I lean towards Indy, but it was, like I make it 6, so I'm not going to bet that. But the 7 was an off-market number, so I was happy to grab that. But I think this is basically as close to spot on as you can be. I mean, Indy has been a very fortunate team this year. They're number 1 in the NFL in turnover EPA. They've gained 20 points on fumbles and 24 points on interceptions. The Bills have been basically a lot more neutral. I think they've gained 8 points overall. It's obviously Josh Allen's made a big jump from last year this year, and the Bills defense is a little bit has improved later on in the season. I know they had some injuries they were fighting through. I'll put it this way: I don't trust Phillip Rivers to not turn the ball over in the fourth quarter of a close game. I mean, I was watching that Jaguars game. I was hoping the Jaguars won because I had a bet on the Dolphins to win exactly 11 games for the season. So at literally 200 to 1 odds or something higher than that. But he, Phillip Rivers threw a fourth quarter interception against the Jaguars, but the Jaguars couldn't do anything. So I think, I think Buffalo has been fantastic. They've been clearly a top team this season, based on this season alone for sure. And so, I basically don't have anything. I only just took 7 because it was a great price.
Well, Indy's, from my numbers, has faced the easiest schedule this year. I think their average opponent was 2 points worse than the average NFL team. So that's certainly something to take into consideration. This is one where I don't know how Buffalo's defense approaches this, because against good teams, Buffalo has tended to play fewer men in the box, have enticed the other team to run, and hoped they can get a stop or two in the early downs and force third downs where their coverage unit is pretty good. If they do that against the Colts and they're successful, I think the Colts will have a miserable game, because I don't think Rivers can do on third down against that team, what he's done against the Jacksonvilles and the Houstons of the world. But that being said, if they're not successful and Jonathan Taylor runs all over them, then this could be a knockdown drag out, because Indy's defense, their schedule notwithstanding, has been pretty good. And Josh Allen really hasn't faced defense. I know Miami was good on paper, but most of their stuff was turnovers this year. Buffalo hasn't faced that great a defense in quite some time, given the injuries of the Steelers that they placed a couple weeks ago, and then the rest of their division. So, this is one I'm with Rufus. I think the number is closer to 6, but at 6.5, there's probably not a ton of value on Indy here.
Yeah, I make it 6. I bet Buffalo anyway. I have Buffalo, and I have Jonathan Taylor to lead the wild card round in rushing yards. So,
what did you bet Buffalo at?
6. I mean, almost even money, 6.5. I think it's -102, -101, a cheap 6.5. So I don't love it, but some of the matchups for me are just, again, Indy in cold weather, Rivers in cold weather, Rivers against at least one decent corner, Rivers in a playoff game, Indy's defense not being all they're cracked up to be, especially against the pass. I have them as a middle of the pack defense.
Wait, what were you telling me about narratives again?
Yeah, I know. It sucked, but here we are. And I just some of the matchups too. And I do believe Indy will be able to run the ball, but if that's all they can do, I'm not sure they can keep up with this offense. Their pass defense should be able to, as far as the Bills' pass offense should be able to get it done there. They just, I was low on Josh Allen again coming into the season, because again he was improving, but we still saw the big mistakes where he wasn't getting his feet set. He was making some bad decisions, and just, if he's not going to do that, they have maybe I don't know, Adams is right there, but maybe the best receiver in the league, and you have 2 other really decent receiving options. And even with maybe their one disparity is the offensive line at times, and he's mobile, and it's not like we've seen a good pass rush out of Indy. So like Indy being able to take advantage of, Josh Allen taking long. He takes a long time to throw at times. His average time to get the ball out is high. But if Indy can't take advantage of that with a bad pass rush, I'm not sure.
Well, but I do think, Allen was second in the league behind Carson Wentz this year in number of turnover-worthy plays. I do think Indy plays a bend but don't break defense. There's a chance that Allen, if they catch the right side of variance, I mean, this is true about every single team in the entire weekend, but if they catch the right side of variance, like, Allen does cross the street a lot on the way to the end zone. And, for him, like we've seen the high end play, right? This is why Buffalo is probably the second best team in the AFC, because they string high end play together. They can probably compete with Kansas City, but there is a situation where Indy plays the slow game with them, doesn't allow the big plays that, for example, Miami did last weekend, and Allen gets tricked into throwing these turnover-worthy plays, and they actually get capitalized on, and then the whole complexion of the game switches. So to me, that's where Indy, I think, is going to go. I don't think they're going to blitz him a lot. I think they're going to sit back and play coverage and hope he makes a mistake, which this season he's been better at avoiding, but he's still not a unicorn as far as he makes a ton of great plays and he avoids negative ones. No, he has his fair share of negative plays. He's just so good at the positive stuff now that we're sort of papering over it.
I mean, does anybody remember that play? Do you guys remember that play against Tennessee in the wild card round last year? The end, like the crazy pitch.
Yeah.
I mean, he does some. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, he takes sacks too. He takes bad sacks, and he runs a lot. Like those plays could turn into fumbles. I'm not saying they're like. I'm just saying that if I'm Indy, I'm looking at this game like just flip the timer over and hopefully he makes a mistake. Don't give up big plays. And that's really Indy's defense. Indy's defense is not an attacking defense. It's a sit back and play zone and hope that a tip ball happens or something like that. And that's probably the right way to play their deep. That's probably the right way to play Buffalo.
And if the hype has kind of been building like all season, especially like the last 3 or 4 games. They put a lot of points on the board. They're putting some good performances. Do we, or how are you guys sort of rating the Bills if the Kansas City Chiefs sort of necessity way of playing doesn't pan out and they don't make it? Do you see the Bills as a legitimate challenger, or whereabouts are they ranking for you?
Oh, they're definitely a legitimate challenger.
Yeah, they match up nicely here. I mean, it's especially against a worser defense, and again, it's probably one that's better than it was at the beginning of the season. But and then who was Eric will know this. Eric always knows this. Who was they lost a piece in the secondary with like a broken leg too.
Buffalo?
No. It's Kansas City. Didn't Kansas City lose?
Oh yeah, DeAndre Baker, but they weren't going to play Baker in the playoffs.
No, I mean depth guy, but it's not helping a bad defense.
Special teamers.
Yeah. You don't want to be missing your special teamers.
No. Yeah, both of these teams are both of these teams do the same thing. They don't play an attacking defense. They try to bait the other team, and Buffalo and Kansas City try to bait the other team into being inefficient by running the ball. And we saw when they played on that makeshift Monday night game, Kansas City just ran it with Clyde Edwards-Helaire for 245 yards. And that was kind of like, I wrote this article about interior defensive linemen. That was kind of the genesis, was that if you want to play 2 high safeties the whole game, you at least need run defenders that will stop the run above a certain amount, or else you're just going to get gashed the whole game. And that whole way of playing sort of goes kaput. It's a good way to reduce variance though, because it's a good way to reduce your risk on defense because you're not getting blown up by these 50-yard touchdowns. But, if another team is patient enough, they can bleed you to death. And I think both of the defenses, Kansas City and Buffalo and Indy, all play that kind of style defense where they prefer coverage, and then they trust their front seven to make tackles. And sometimes it works, and sometimes the other team gets high on running the ball all game, and they end up being less efficient on offense as a result.
Yeah, and like you said with the blitzing on Allen, sometimes you see coaches, I don't know if they feel like they need to get cute or try something that, especially if they're a touchdown underdog and they know they're not supposed to win. I think if Indy does something different and said, let's come out and try to blitz more than we do, it makes them worse. It's going to make them worse. And I'm going to watch for stuff like that this weekend as well.
We'll get on to our next game. We've got LA Rams at Seattle Seahawks, and the Tracer put this one at 4.5, 42.5 point total. I think it's kind of in that handicap, certainly in that sort of middle ground. It's moving around a little bit, and it could sort of move later towards the end of the week. But it looks like a very different matchup to the first half of the season. We talk about sort of the hype around the Bills. The Seahawks were obviously the early season stars and dropped away pretty dramatically, especially on offense. And then for the Rams, I mean, I don't know if it depends on Goff. I don't know what the news is. Kind of some are saying it's a long shot. Some are saying it's quite likely, but it's a broken thumb, isn't it, at the end of the day? So I'm not sure how big of an impact he can have, even if he does play. But what have they played twice already this season? One apiece, I think. 4.5 points, Andy. What do you think of that, Mark?
I guess I'm surprised they're leaving this up. The fact that they're leaving this up with the Goff uncertainty either means that they're pretty sure Goff doesn't play, or it doesn't matter. Like a hobbled Goff hand is the same as a Wolford. I think my appetite for getting involved in Seattle playoff games has probably been filled over the past few years. Close game, and again, Seattle never plays a normal game anyway, but I mean, my numbers aren't fully prepared to adjust for Wolford. I was hoping we'd see a normal game last week, and I could get a read on what the team looks like with Wolford, and then we get all the injuries. Each team was missing at least one good receiver. I don't know how you rate Larry Fitzgerald at this point in his career, but then Kyler goes out, so the game got just wonky last week. I don't know if I have a good read on the Rams at all. If I had to bet this game, maybe the under if it keeps getting steamed up, honestly. But
avoiding narratives. Haven't you got a good stat on Wolford?
Wolford, he hasn't ever lost a playoff game. He's like 2-0 in bowls.
Wolford last week was I believe second in the league in what we call big time throws, which are like, and I know the NGS people, the guys with the tracking data, found that he had the second highest rate of throws into tight windows. So the aggressiveness rate, like he wasn't Alex Smith out there, that's for sure. And so I don't know. I think Andy's second conclusion is probably right, that the betting, like, people just see the Rams offense as McVay and a couple good weapons on the outside, a decent offensive line, and think, who cares who the quarterback is? Goff's not all that good to begin with.
Well, and Goff can't run the ball like Wolford can. I mean, you saw that he added an entirely new dimension to that offense. And so, I mean, for me, this is a really hard game to handicap, because normally I would go, I have a prior for Wolford. He's undrafted. He's making his second career start, and he's only playing because the starting quarterback's injured. Like, that right there says it's going to be a massive downgrade, basically, just based on the information I have. And, his numbers were pretty pedestrian last week, but I mean, I watched a good amount of the game just because I'm invested in the Rams. And actually in this Calcutta as well as future stuff from earlier in the year. So his numbers were pretty pedestrian, but even if they weren't, that wouldn't really swing things a lot. Even if he went all Jalen Hurts in his first game or something like that, just because it is one game. But you're right. I mean, this isn't one size fits all, even though Massey Peabody kind of treats it like it is. We know that there are nuances to it. And the fact is, like, McVay is sort of he's a master of scheming. And I think, and from what we've heard out of LA, even before this game, it sounded like the Rams were really high on Wolford and were really excited to have him be playing. And McVay just was gushing about the fact what he could do running the ball after the game. So, I mean, this is a situation where my numbers would say Wolford's a massive downgrade, Seattle has value. Versus, if Goff was playing, my number would be Seattle -3. And so without Goff, I'm going to be a touchdown or higher. So I probably am going to bet some Seattle, just largely to hedge, because I do have a lot of Rams exposure. And so, but it's again, I don't know the right answer here. I would say it's somewhere in the middle. I don't think Wolford is he and Goff are not the same, obviously, but I don't think it's a truly 5-point difference either.
Yeah. Well, and this is interesting, right? Because I think both Goff and Seattle's offense have declined over the past 8 weeks. I think Goff because he's just not that good of a quarterback, and Seattle out of their own free will.
Yeah.
Right. Running the football more on early downs, sort of. And they were 6-3 and they finished 6-1. So now they're getting the positive affirmation of a Seattle-ifying of a season that was profoundly anti-Seahawks in the first 6 or 7 weeks. And so, secondary to what you're saying, I know you guys exponentially weigh weeks that are more distant, but even then, like you're talking about data from 2 distinct football teams. And when I look at, I have the Rams as the best defense in the entire NFL, and I think they're even better against a team that has maybe fewer weapons. Like I think the Seahawks have 2 really good weapons, and the Rams have one, extremely good cornerback who shuts down one of the aspects of the other teams, and then they have a really good scheme. And so I wonder, in the first Seattle game. The LA Rams just completely shut. It was the first team to shut down Russ all year. And they basically did the exact same thing in week 16. It's just that the Rams couldn't really do anything on offense. If Wolford can give them anything or Goff can give them anything, this one's going to be a close one. And so, I mean, if anything, I would take LA, but there's a lot of, the uncertainty here is really clouding sort of, my read on this.
I like that you say that. I want the Rams here.
Right, let's.
My Rams number is always going to be high, and I just like the Wolford thing is scaring me away. So
the Rams offense. The Rams offense, it seems like every year under McVay has gotten worse at the end of the season.
Yeah.
Well, is there anything to that?
It's hard. Yeah, no, you're right. Obviously the most drastic example has been how they've played in the playoffs, right? And in 2017, they got absolutely boat raced by the Falcons at home, and then in the Super Bowl in 18 they got beat up pretty heavily by the Patriots, and then last year they didn't even make the playoffs. I think McVay is very good when he can go to the lab and cook something up for 6 months and come rise up from the water and play offense for 12 weeks or so. But once teams adjust, it's really hard. I mean, Jared Goff is averaging negative expected points when he drops back to throw now. He has more turnover-worthy plays than what we call big-time throws. But McVay has it in him. I remember that Monday night game at Tampa when they were 3-4 point underdogs. That was one of the best schemed games on offense I've seen this year. So he certainly has it in him. And the question becomes, like, against a Seattle defense that I don't think is all that imposing, does he feel like he needs to put together a game plan to really win a football game like that? Sometimes he does, and sometimes, frankly, he comes out with the most vanilla things in the world. It's very Andy Reid-like, and I don't think they obviously have the talent to be able to do that and win.
Maybe he should cook up this great, novel scheme in the offseason and wait and put it in later on and so nobody's ready for it. It's like if you had the Wildcat offense start in the playoffs or something like that.
Right.
Right, yeah. Let's get us on to the Tampa Bay Buccaneers at Washington football team, and we've had a move against Washington here. Don't know if it's angry Giants fans or people that actually see value in it, but it was 7.5. It actually touched in -9 on Tampa Bay. I think it's at 8 now, and the total's on 45.5. I think we can avoid debate around everything surrounding Philly's the decision to play the way they did and deal with what we've got. We've got Washington football team. It's going to be built on defense. We know that. Probably maybe a simple question of how well Brady's protected, how well he plays, and especially with an informed Antonio Brown to. Is it as simple as that, Eric? Is there more to it? And what do you kind of make of an 8-point handicap to make up in a wildcard game?
Well, I think Tampa is probably going to be the most teased team in the entire weekend, right? Probably people are going to try to tease that with Buffalo, you think, in the first game?
Bama.
Yeah. eight's a lot, but Tampa has been disposing of like kind of poor teams. I know the Atlanta game it took them a half to sort of get their bearings, but obviously Detroit on the road in the Christmas weekend and last week, Atlanta hung around for a while, but basically they got rid of them quick. I just don't see Washington being able to move the football enough on a Bucs defense that I think is overrated, but good enough to beat a bad team like Washington. Alex Smith this year, only 12.3% of his passes are positively graded by us. There isn't another player on my list. Dwayne Haskins is at 15.6 to put it in perspective, and no one else is below 17, and that includes guys like Nick Foles, Ben Roethlisberger, Mike Glennon. Smith is avoiding negatively graded plays, but not they're about the same. And every time he drops back to pass, Washington loses about a fifth of an expected point. So as much as Smith's good in the sense of not turning the ball over, I think this game is going to require increased variance, which is why you saw Ron Rivera open up the possibility. Maybe he's just trolling Philly fans, or Giants fans. He opened up the possibility of playing some Taylor Heineke this week, and I think that might actually need to be the case if they're going to do anything close to winning this game. I think Tampa rolls here. And that's basically just based upon my opinion of Smith's distribution of outcomes.
So the question with Smith is this a conscious decision? I mean, it's a guy has to be so wide open to throw the ball downfield for him. Like his just natural instinct is to just check it down. I mean, I guess I compare it to in golf, like a player like Jim Furyk or Steve Stricker, who, hits fairways, hits greens, doesn't go for he's not attacking the pins as much necessarily, but then if you play like an event that's like a modified stable for format or a match play or something like that, is he going to change his stripes and be able to adapt to that? Like, is it a conscious decision because Smith thinks that actually helps the team versus is it just the way he is and you can't change it? So I don't know the answer to that.
You're saying he would change because it's single elimination playoffs and you're not thinking about, just not losing games, or what are you saying he would change?
To embrace variance. I mean,
sure.
Probably not if he's making a conscious decision to check down because he thinks it's I don't know. But yeah, it's the
Heineke.
It's not easy. Yeah. Well, Heineken, whatever his name is, he I watched the Washington game where he played, and he, like, as a fan, this is not as an analyst or any sort of quantitative person. As a fan, like, I thought I enjoyed watching him. I thought he threw the ball downfield. He had some really good throws. He had like a bad throw or two, but he seemed like agile in the pocket. Like, I was like, let's have this guy start. I mean, it's a pretty low bar for Washington right now in terms of starting quarterback. So I would love to see him start.
Golf,
and you need to embrace variance for Washington. Sorry?
I think it's Wolford Goff maybe again, where maybe it doesn't make a big difference based on how little aggression we see from Alex Smith and what little we know of Taylor Heineke and just where this offense stands versus this defense. And, maybe it is a slight advantage, like Eric said, to make this team think that they have to prepare for two quarterbacks, even if they don't. The minorest of advantages. But again,
and what Eric said about and what I didn't mean to interrupt. I'm channeling my inner Jeff Ma a little bit, but if what Eric said about Tampa blowing out the bad teams, like, and I backed up with Bruce Arians over the years. He's been great against the bad teams, not as good against the good teams. He's someone who basically says, we're doing it this way. Screw what the other team does. We're playing our game, and that's going to work against bad teams. But so this, I think I'm basically right on market here. A little over 7. So,
all right, then let's get on to our next one. We got Baltimore Ravens at Tennessee Titans, and this one certainly attracting a lot of interest. It's pretty evened out on the 3 so far in favor of Baltimore. Also, the biggest total on the board, 54.5. Bettors have nudged it up slightly, and I guess you could. It's easy to see why. We talked about narrative. We've got a good one here. Tennessee knocked out Baltimore last season, didn't they? And I think the other thing is going to be that the Ravens haven't been the same team since then, really. I think we talked about it a little bit, and then Eric, I think I posed it to you about Lamar and have teams figured them out? Is it because he's nursing an injury? Is it the other pieces that aren't working out? But they obviously had a unique style last year that could kind of blow teams away that we've probably only seen once. I think it was the Bengals game that Lamar had a really big game there. But it's probably the most interesting matchup of the round for me anyway. Andy, I don't know about you, but what do you make of the numbers here?
Kind of opened where we thought it would open, I guess. If you want the narrative of the weekend, like the playoff revenge angle is, I suppose it's ripe for the picking on this one. Yeah, I'm not super interested in laying points on the road, but I mean, this is probably right where my numbers are at. Baltimore has played well, but against bad teams. It kind of goes back to what we just said about Arians. Like, is there something to be said for that? I mentioned this early in the season with Green Bay, I think it was. Green Bay had a couple of easier games. Once we found out how bad Minnesota's defense was, said, and there was a thing, in the weeks 3, 4, 5, I believe, somewhere in there, we said, is Green Bay good? Like, are they really good? Is Rodgers back? Is he having a season? Because they've played bad teams, and, good teams beat good teams, but good teams also beat the tar out of bad teams. So I think maybe this was, I don't ever want to use momentum as a word because it's not a thing, but it's good to get the kinks worked out of the offense and watch Lamar play like he's not injured. I think he was maybe carrying more of an injury earlier in the season than we thought. And this will be a good test for the Tennessee offense against a decent defense. Is what I would have said before I watched the Browns game. Like, there is precedent for this defense to be scored on. I'm not sure if Tannehill can do that, but I'm pretty much on market here. I want this to be. I might bet some small alt overs and just hope we get a repeat of the Browns game. I don't want to be involved, but it's a noon game. I'd be sitting there watching it.
Yeah, well, was it knee? Was it ankle, Eric? I can't remember, but we talked about it earlier on. And are we going to see the Lamar of old, I guess, is the simple question.
Yeah, he had his knee drained, I think, during one of those days early in the season. I think it was right before the Washington football team game. And he was kind of a little banged up there. They also had, the Pittsburgh game they lost at home, but they thoroughly outplayed Pittsburgh in that game. And the other Tennessee game that they had went into overtime. They had a big lead in that game. So I think something, Baltimore season's been a little bit misleading. That being said, Tannehill has played really good football this year. I mean, he's, top 10 in our grades. EPA is like, 1/5 of a point every time he drops back. I think he's leading the league in percentage of positively graded throws, which, I think shows a little bit, why they could probably lose this game, because they just don't throw enough. And that, to me, is their strength, even with the narrative surrounding Derrick Henry. I think both of these teams can get in the same situation, which is if they go run, pass on their first drive, have to punt and give up a touchdown on defense. Like they're neither of these teams are really that comfortable playing a pass first game, even though I think in that situation, Tennessee's better. And we saw that in the first matchup where Tennessee came from behind when they had to throw. I think Baltimore's in a little bit of trouble when they get from behind and have to be a pass first team. So that, I don't know. I bet Tennessee at +3.5, and then, now it's 3. I kind of think 3 is probably the right place for it to be.
Yeah, I have it pretty close to market. I have it 2.5, so I lean Tennessee. Somehow my partner was able to grab a 4.5 on Sunday. I think probably I have no idea where it was. It's marked on my sheet because I'm literally looking at line histories at all these books, and I'm seeing 3.5. One book opened with a 4, so it may have been in Vegas while other games are still going on. I don't know, but I'll take it. But I wouldn't play anything at 3 here.
All right, then. Well, I'll move us on to a game where you might play something, Rufus. We've got Chicago Bears at New Orleans Saints, and if there's a team that's going to give Washington a run for their money as the worst team left in it, it's going to be Chicago. Dropped away after a decent start, I guess, but they've beaten teams that are, I guess, maybe you'd expect them to, but really struggled against the elite teams like a team like New Orleans. Breeze getting better, I guess, after a couple of weeks of injury. I think Kamara's back as well. The odds suggest biggest mismatch of the wild card round. It's 10.5 after opening at 10. I said you like the Saints, Rufus, but double digits on the spread. Is it too much for you?
It is too much for me here. I'm not playing the Bears either. So my numbers with the Massey Peabody number is 10.2. The Massey Peabody number without a prior is 8. And I think this year I've been, I think I've been a little bit. I think priors should get a little bit less weight in a season like this. And so I'm kind of going and incorporating a little bit of the no prior number, averaging down towards that a little bit. So I make it I'm basically putting it like 9.5, 10. So no opinion there. Chicago, New Orleans has, they've been pretty lucky in the turnover department this year. Chicago, out of all the teams remaining, they're one of 3 teams that has negative turnover EPA in the year, and they are the worst of all the playoff teams, with negative 13 points lost due to turnovers, whereas New Orleans is plus 23, and the extreme high Indy at plus 44. So Chicago has been a little bit unfortunate there, although most of that has been interception related. Actually, all of it has. But I think Trubisky is a lot better than Foles. And my numbers on him have been higher than Foles' numbers all season. And so if Foles was starting, I probably would have that number a lot higher, or not a lot higher, but a point or two higher. I think the market is basically spot on, or even a little bit high on New Orleans here.
I agree. Look, Nick Foles had 335 dropbacks this year. Mitch Trubisky had 333. Trubisky actually graded a little worse for us, but on the per play basis, but I think he actually is the quarterback who can at least make them competitive in this game. And here's why. Trubisky, for some reason, I don't know why, but they averaged positive expected points with him on the field throwing the ball, and Nick Foles is negative almost a fifth of a point. Trubisky has 24% of his dropbacks are positively graded, 18% are negatively graded. Foles was 17 and 13. So Foles was just playing a very, very narrow, credible interval of plays. And when you're that big of an underdog, I just don't think you can win that way. At least with Trubisky, again, this is sort of a Ricky Bobby situation. Like, if you lose, who cares, right? But what you need to do in the playoffs is string a bunch of good things together. And Trubisky at least has shown the potential to do that. So this one's weird. I got some New Orleans at minus 9.5 early. I think that's probably where I'll stop. Just because, this could be a blowout, much like the last week's game was, where Teddy Bridgewater couldn't get anything done, Philip Walker couldn't get anything done, and it's like 33-7. But we have seen New Orleans under Sean Payton with basically these same players struggle in the playoffs, especially at home. And so I don't think it's a lock under any circumstances that New Orleans is going to beat up on Chicago, because Chicago does have some components. They have a good defense. They have the most valuable edge player in the league this year in Khalil Mack. And they have some, really good corners. I know they were out last week. If they're playing this week, Chicago's not a complete dumpster fire.
No, I make it 9. I agree with a lot of that. Although, there is some going back to the Ravens thing. You saw the Bears Trubisky's good. They're winning games. It was the Lions and the Vikings and a really depleted Texans. And then obviously the Jaguars was a bad game. And then you get here and they give up 7 yards per play to Green Bay. And Green Bay's offense has really hit its stride, and Rodgers is looking great right now. And Devontae Adams, stud, but it's another tough offense they're going. I don't know if there's truly signal in New Orleans struggling in the playoffs. I guess you see more bad luck than anything. Like the Vikings game, they were losing badly, and they had a nice comeback that was sabotaged by a crazy play, the ref play. I don't know what happened last year, or the second game against the Vikings. That was just, they came out very flat. But it's a team that is probably 10 points better. I won't be getting. I was hoping this total would open a little higher. I guess I'm more down on the Bears offense. They had the ball a lot versus Green Bay. They just weren't doing things with their drives, their third down efficiency. They went for the fourth down, or they went on fourth down 6 times. It took a lot of I mean, they were 4 for 4 to start on fourth down. It took a lot of getting these short fourth downs. It took a lot of, some variance there for them even to get to 16 points against a good team at home. So I guess I just don't rate this offense that well against good teams. I think Trubisky is better than Foles, but I just don't think it's a good offense. And I don't think Buster Skrine's good. I mean, getting it, he's better than his backup, but.
Right, let's wrap up with the Browns at the Steelers then, and I think we mentioned this, or Eric mentioned this earlier at the top of the show. It's been a bit of a weird one. We were at Pinnacle, had it at -3.5 on Pittsburgh. Obviously, then the news broke about the Browns head coach, 2 coaching staff members, I think 2 players as well. It went -5.5. It's on 6 now. It's an instant rematch, obviously, from what we've just had from the weekend. Pittsburgh rested quite a few players that are now going to be coming back. Big Ben obviously being one of them, but really poor end to the season from Pittsburgh. What were they, 11-0, and then lost, can't remember how many on the trot, and then kind of got 1 win in there, but they're going to have to now kind of switch it back on. Big season for the Browns, making the playoffs. A few things kind of fell their way, I think, but it's going to be difficult for Baker against the defense of the Steelers if they can sort of turn it on. But whether or not they can, I don't know. Did anyone get in early on this? Is anyone sort of waiting to get in with more news coming, or how are we feeling about this one?
I got in at Pittsburgh at -3.5. It's the strongest play for me this week. I'm just very low on Cleveland, as I have been all season.
It's off the board at a lot of places, I believe, now with the big mess that we mentioned real early in the show. But yeah,
we're still up at Pinnacle, I think.
You're still up? Oh.
Yeah, I think it's gone to 6.
The strength of Cleveland, I think, is really going to be Their strength was offensive line. Joe Bitonio is one of the COVID-19 guys. They've been a little banged up at tackle. Pittsburgh has 3 players on their defensive line that have 60 or more pressures. So that's a big deal. Devin Bush has been out long enough where I think they've acclimated his backup in. One of the things that's been noticeable about Pittsburgh over, like, starting with the second half of the Indy game, but even continuing with Mason Rudolph last week, is they've sort of eschewed the shorter passes for some of the longer passes, which I think really helps them, honestly, because when you drop as many balls as they have, when you're as inaccurate as Roethlisberger is, you really can't score on low ADOT stuff up and down the field because it causes you to have to be too perfect. They went down the field a lot against Indy in the second half. They went down the field last week, obviously, in a game where they try. I mean, they had some success against Cleveland in the second half with Mason Rudolph. If they continue to deploy that strategy against what I would consider to be a very fragile Cleveland team, both injury-wise and COVID-wise, I think that they'll have some success. I think 6 is probably too many, obviously, if you're going to lay with Pittsburgh, but it does present a decent teaser at this point now, right, where you're at 6 and you could tease it down to a pick if you're confident that Pittsburgh will come out with a win.
And did you get involved in this one?
Yeah, it just sucks hitting it late. Like even though it's probably a decent teaser late, and I mean, put it with Tampa. But yeah, it sucks missing the number. But COVID news this year has given it, and COVID news has taken away. I've had some good numbers come through and some bad numbers come through, and it's just all part of the game, I guess. But it's always fun getting an early number and then watching the other team get a whole bunch of, like, I can't imagine having the early New Orleans number and then watching Denver lose all their quarterbacks. Had to just be giggling to yourself. So I'm not interested in betting this at 6.5, but at the early number, I did lean Pittsburgh. I think we will see a better offense with Big Ben finally getting some rest. He's old. He's super old. And they haven't had a bye since week 4.
Yeah, they never really had an actual bye, which
they actually played. They practiced up to the bye and then got a surprise bye. They didn't get a real bye. If they did get a half bye, it was early in the season. And honestly, one like that week that Ben stayed home and didn't practice all week because he faked an injury, he looked good that week. Like, that guy needs his rest. He's a 10-hour sleep kind of night, kind of guy. Ben coming off some rest, I think this offense might look a little more towards what it looked like at the beginning of the season when they were moving the ball nicely.
I think if anyone feels bad about missing the early number, you got to feel for Batonio, who Eric mentioned. Was it seven years with the Browns, 6 losing seasons? He makes the playoffs, and the guy gets COVID. So feel for him. I mean, we're over the hour here. We've somehow managed to run longer than we would with 3 times as many games. But Andy, Rufus, and Eric, thank you very much for coming on and talking us through the wild card. And thank you to everyone for listening. We will be back next week to cover the next round of games. All of the odds that we've discussed are available on pinnacle.com. And as always, please gamble responsibly.